In the bitter cold of December 1944, the forests of the Ardennes were silent under a heavy coat of snow. The German army, thought beaten and retreating only weeks before, had suddenly lunged forward in a massive surprise offensive. It was called Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, Operation Watch on the Rhine, but the world would remember it as the Battle of the Bulge. For a moment, it looked as if Hitler had done the impossible. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers, tanks, and guns crashed through the thin American lines in Belgium and Luxembourg. The objective was bold, even delusional, to split the Allied front, capture the port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace on the Western Front. At the tip of this armored spear was Kampfgruppe Peiper, a battle group from the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. Its commander, SS Standartenführer Joachim Peiper, was only 29 years old, but already one of the most decorated officers in the Waffen-SS. He had fought on the Eastern Front, in Italy, and in France, and was known for his energy, aggression, and unshakable belief in victory. But what Peiper didn't have, and what the entire German army was running out of, was fuel. By late 1944, Germany's oil industry had collapsed. Allied bombers had destroyed most of the synthetic fuel plants that kept the Wehrmacht running. Romania's oil fields, once the Reich's main source of crude, had been captured by the Soviets. Every division, every tank, every truck in Hitler's army was starved for gasoline. Some units in the Ardennes offensive were ordered to seize Allied fuel as part of their plan, not as an advantage, but as a necessity. Without it, they wouldn't reach the front lines, let alone the Meuse River. Peiper's orders were simple on paper, but nearly impossible in practice. Break through American lines near Losheim, capture bridges over the Meuse, and open the way to Antwerp. His armored columns stretched for miles. Tanks, half-tracks, fuel trucks, artillery pieces, and supply vehicles. But it was already running low on fuel before the first shots were fired. In the early hours of December 16, 1944, the offensive began under a thick fog that grounded Allied aircraft. German artillery thundered across the Ardennes, and Peiper's column rolled forward. They smashed through thin American positions, scattering infantry units that never expected an attack in this quiet sector. But progress was slow. Snow and mud clogged the roads, destroyed vehicles blocked narrow paths, and every mile consumed precious gallons of fuel they could not replace. By December 17th, Peiper's Kampfgruppe had reached the Belgian village of Honsfeld, a small farming community occupied by elements of the 99th Infantry Division. The Americans were surprised, and the defense was quickly overwhelmed. Peiper's men captured dozens of prisoners, several supply trucks, and to their astonishment, a large American fuel depot. It was one of those small moments in war that reveal far more than they should. Inside the depot sat over 50,000 gallons of gasoline, neatly stored in drums and tankers, guarded only by a few soldiers who were quickly taken prisoner. To Peiper's troops, it was a miracle. Their tanks were dangerously low. Some had less than 20 gallons left. Mechanics had already started siphoning fuel from wrecked vehicles. Now suddenly, they had enough to continue, for a while. But for Peiper, it was something else entirely. He later told fellow officers that finding that depot was the worst thing that could have happened. When one of his subordinates asked why, he replied quietly, "Because it shows how hopeless this war has become." To Peiper, the discovery was not just about fuel. It was a glimpse into the industrial divide that defined the war's outcome. The Americans could leave behind 50,000 gallons of gasoline, enough to keep an entire German panzer regiment moving for days, and hardly notice its loss. For the Wehrmacht, that amount represented more fuel than some divisions received in months. Germany had spent years perfecting tactics, weapons, and discipline, but by the winter of 1944, the war had become a battle of production, and in that arena, they had no chance. The United States produced 1.8 billion barrels of oil during the war. Germany, despite every effort, managed only 33 million. American refineries ran day and night, feeding an endless supply line that stretched from Texas to Tunisia, from England to the Pacific. The U.S. Army alone consumed more gasoline than the entire Axis alliance combined. In Peiper's view, finding that abandoned American depot was like lifting the curtain on the truth. Germany was fighting an enemy that could afford to burn more fuel in a day than the Reich could refine in a week, and still have reserves to spare. Nevertheless, orders were orders. Peiper's men refueled their tanks and pressed on. Their goal was Stavelot, then Le Glaise, and finally the Meuse River. But the narrow Ardennes roads were choked with traffic. American engineers blew up bridges ahead of them. Small American units, often outnumbered, ambushed the column again and again. Each delay burned more of the precious gasoline. In the chaos, Peiper's men committed several atrocities against American soldiers and Belgian civilians, acts that would later haunt his name forever. The most infamous was the Malmedy massacre, where more than 80 American prisoners were shot near the crossroads at Bagnes. It remains one of the most brutal episodes of the Western Front. For Peiper, the violence, the freezing cold, and the stalled advance all blended into a growing sense of futility. His tanks were burning more fuel sitting idle in the snow than moving towards Antwerp. The radio reports were grim. Other German units were stalled, surrounded, or destroyed. The Luftwaffe could no longer protect the roads or deliver supplies. By December 21st, Peiper's Kampfgruppe was effectively cut off. American forces had encircled his position near Le Glaise, and his fuel reserves were nearly gone again. The engines of his beloved Panther and Tiger tanks coughed and died one by one. He had no choice but to abandon them. In a blizzard on December 23rd, Peiper ordered his men to destroy all vehicles, burn the remaining fuel, and attempt a breakout on foot. They left behind over 100 tanks, trucks, and guns, the pride of Germany's armored corps, now frozen hulks in the snow. When Peiper and his survivors finally reached German lines days later, they were exhausted, hungry, and broken. The offensive had failed. The Battle of the Bulge, though fierce and costly for the Allies, had ended as Hitler's last great mistake. For Peiper, the memory of Honsfeld remained. The sight of those rows of fuel drums, the abundance, the ease with which America supplied its armies became a symbol of everything Germany lacked. Historians would later note that the Battle of the Bulge was lost not in the forests of Belgium, but in the factories of Detroit and the oil fields of Texas. American logistics, once mocked by the Germans as clumsy and overbuilt, proved to be the true weapon of victory. During the same winter that Peiper's tanks ran dry, the U.S. Army was operating with more than 400,000 trucks, 40,000 tanks, and enough fuel reserves to fight 2 more wars. The Red Ball Express, the legendary truck convoy system, delivered over 12 million gallons of gasoline a day to the front lines.
Peiper's 50,000-gallon windfall at Honsfeld, so precious to him, was just a fraction of what the Allies burned daily to keep their war machine moving. And it was this realization, more than any battle or defeat, that convinced Peiper Germany's cause was doomed. No amount of courage or tactical brilliance could compensate for the crushing weight of American industry. After the war, Peiper was captured by U.S. forces and stood trial for war crimes related to the Malmedy massacre. He was sentenced to death, later commuted to life in prison, and eventually released in the 1950s. He lived quietly in France until 1976, when he was murdered in his home by unknown assailants, likely in revenge for his wartime record. But beyond the controversy surrounding his name, his experience during the Ardennes offensive remains a revealing moment in history, the point where even the most loyal and capable German officers understood the futility of the fight. Fuel had always been the hidden currency of World War II. Every tank, every plane, every ship ran on it. For Germany, oil had been the Achilles heel from the start. Their campaigns, from the drive to the Caucasus in 1942 to the push through the Ardennes in 1944, were driven as much by the search for fuel as by military ambition. When Hitler launched the Ardennes offensive, his generals warned him that it was a gamble they couldn't afford. The plan required more than 400,000 gallons of fuel per day, and the reserves simply didn't exist. Even if Peiper had captured every Allied depot in Belgium, it wouldn't have been enough. Meanwhile, American fuel supplies were so vast that commanders worried more about storage than shortages. The U.S. had built entire artificial harbors in Normandy just to unload tankers. Engineers laid thousands of miles of pipeline from the beaches to the front lines. In England, depots the size of small towns were filled with drums and barrels marked MT-80, motor transport fuel, standard issue. The contrast couldn't have been sharper.
When Peiper's column stumbled upon the Honsfeld depot, it wasn't just an accident of war. It was an unintentional revelation, a snapshot of the war's true balance. Eyewitnesses from his unit later described how Peiper stood silently beside the captured fuel trucks, staring at the endless rows of drums. One recalled him muttering under his breath, "We are finished, even if we win here." Another remembered him turning away in disgust when he learned that the Americans had left the fuel behind deliberately, confident they could replace it within hours. The lesson wasn't lost on historians either. The entire German war effort, so often portrayed as technologically advanced, had in fact been crippled by shortages. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe could barely fly. Training programs were halted for lack of fuel. Even the mighty Tiger tanks often traveled by rail, saving their limited gasoline for combat zones. In contrast, the United States had standardized logistics to a science. Soldiers joked that the Army traveled on its stomach and its fuel trucks. Every American advance was backed by convoys of fuel, ammunition, and food stretching back to ports and refineries thousands of miles away. In a sense, Peiper's realization at Honsfeld was the war in miniature, one side running on fumes, the other overflowing with resources. As the Battle of the Bulge came to an end in January 1945, the Germans had lost more than 100,000 men, 800 tanks, and almost all their remaining fuel reserves. What little oil they had left was consumed in the desperate defense of the Reich's borders.
When Allied forces crossed the Rhine 2 months later, they did so in trucks and tanks running on American gasoline. Behind them stretched a logistical network unmatched in history: pipelines, tankers, depots, and convoys, all symbols of industrial power harnessed to a moral cause. Germany's defeat was sealed long before Berlin fell. It was sealed when men like Peiper, hardened veterans of the Eastern Front, stood in front of captured American fuel and understood that no strategy, no bravery, no ideology could overcome the simple arithmetic of production. In war, spirit and courage matter, but fuel moves armies. The irony of Honsfeld is that it gave Peiper the means to keep fighting a little longer, but also the knowledge that victory was impossible. The very thing that extended his campaign also exposed its futility. Years later, military historians would revisit the Battle of the Bulge and marvel at the determination of German soldiers who fought on despite impossible odds. But they would also point out that the offensive had never stood a real chance. It was a final act of defiance from a nation already collapsing under the weight of its own exhaustion. In the end, the story of Joachim Peiper and the 50,000 gallons of American fuel is not just about triumph or tragedy alone. It's about the realization that modern war is won not just by bravery or tactics, but by the unseen machinery behind it, the factories, refineries, and supply lines that feed the front. Peiper understood this too late. When he saw the vast stores of gasoline abandoned by an enemy who could afford to waste it, he saw the future. It was the moment he realized that Germany's war was over, even if the fighting continued for months more. The depot at Honsfeld was just one small corner of the Ardennes, but in its quiet piles of fuel drums lay the full weight of industrial war and the final, undeniable proof that Germany had been outbuilt, outproduced, and ultimately outlasted.